About 18 months ago, I think, John Hunt, who has published a number of my books, well, I sent him a sort of modest suggestion for a book that I wanted to write of about 100 pages. And he wrote back saying that there's a book in America called A Ranking of the 100 Most Influential Persons in History. And would I do a sort of similar book about those who have the most spiritual influence on humanity? And I got the impression the book in America was a bestseller, but I haven't quite competed with that yet in this country. Anyhow, it's a sort of, it sounds rather like a sort of spiritual rich list. But the Times are Sunday Times more interested in people who have got wealth and so on. But I suppose my immediate fear, other than sort of whether I'd ever finish it, was the sense of hubris. Who was I to choose the 100 and to write about them? And I think I must make clear, I don't sort of claim to preempt the recording angel. It's not a sort of ticking off of who is the holiest person. And I think the key word would be those who've had the most influence. And influence may not be the same as holiness. For example, I do include Khalil Gibran because, of course, his book, The Prophet, is very, very widely read. But he, in fact, himself said there's a difference between a poet and a prophet. A prophet has to live up to what he preaches. A poet doesn't. And some of you will know a little bit about Khalil Gibran. Well, if you read it, you don't know about life. You'll discover he had a sort of colourful life in the way the popular press would use colourful. So, but I mean, it's interesting, a very interesting character. And I didn't know very much about his background in the sort of Syrian Christian church and his relationship with the family. So he has a very, very interesting life. But then my second problem was if I put people in order. Well, first of all, everyone opening the book would look to see how high up was their particular guru, and they would complain and not buy the book if it wasn't in the first 11. Because they might just tolerate if they were sitting on the bench. But so that was the first problem. Now, I do give at the end of a book my own listing, because I thought I couldn't sort of chicken out of the sort of what the John Hunt had wanted to choose the 100. But in fact, by doing it that way, and one always hopes, not unlike Margaret, you won't start at the back. But my hope is it then becomes once it's also an educational exercise, because in fact, trying to think who has had most influence is quite a good way of reflecting on the important. I mean, you could just read and absorb the facts about a number of people, but trying to think why some are in it and why not, and so on, perhaps can help us reflect together. And I do say at the beginning, I rather hope, I mean, you're not the sort of person who looks up the end of a detective story before you start. Or always turn to the sports pages. But, you must read the book as you want to. And sometimes if the end is interesting, you read the beginning. So, but the more important reason for doing the way I did it is that people need to be seen in context. And for example, I couldn't write, say, about the Dalai Lama without at least some reference to the Buddha. So therefore, doing it historically meant, it doesn't have to repeat oneself. But I think also doing it historically, I hope, highlights the cross-fertilization of religion. Because so often, both our religious story and indeed our historical story is told in isolation. I mean, I suppose I half knew, but I didn't sort of think about it until doing the book, that Akbar was Mughal emperor at the same time as Queen Elizabeth I was queen in this country. But somehow we learn history in isolation, and that sort of interplay. And perhaps I give another example. of, I think, very significant cross-fertilization was the influence the Zoroastrians had on the Jewish people when they were in exile into Babylon. And of course, therefore, from that comes also influence on Christianity and Islam and so on. So that sort of, again, that interplay. And again, to mention the great Muslim scholars like Averroes, Avicenna, and their influence on Maimonides and on Aquinas, the great sort of thinkers of Islam. And I suppose above all, I hope that the book helps people to see that our spiritual history, as well as our sort of practical history, is interconnected, and that our different spiritual currents flow into one great river. And I'd like to read, if I may, a sort of couple of paragraphs to try and explain this, because, well, I say, my picture, I found it helpful to picture the spiritual history of humankind as a great river with various springs, sources, and tributaries, always changing, sometimes dividing, maybe with backwaters, but moving forwards and enriching the present with what is carried forward from the past and opening up new vistas for the future. And interestingly, just after I'd written that, I came across a writing by Diana Eck. Some of you will know Diana Eck from the Center of World Studies, World Religions at Harvard, a very distinguished writer. And she used the same image. Religious traditions are far more like rivers than stones, in that they flow and change, sometimes drying up in arid land, sometimes dramatically changing course in new territories. All of us contribute to the rivers of our traditions. We do not know how we will change the river or be changed with it as we experience its currents. Well, she's talking more about the change, but any religion is an ever-changing tradition. But I think my image was more also to suggest the confluence, the coming together of religions, which is not, in my view, a sort of artificial mixing. But as we meet and learn from each other, we are enriched in our own traditions. And I think I can think of a number of people who feel, yes, we belong to a particular body, but we've really moved beyond a particular institutional religion. That can nourish us, but others are nourished from other traditions, and we can all learn from the different traditions. And yes, I mean, this is towards the end, after I've dared to rank for people. Anyhow, more important than putting them in order is to appreciate the particularity of their contribution to the amazingly rich and varied spiritual creativity to which we are heirs. Each of the great spiritual traditions has enormous gifts to share with the world. Treasuring our tradition, we are enriched by learning to appreciate the wisdom and holiness of our faith communities. In so doing, as in a beautiful garden, we marvel at the variety of flowers and plants. So in contemplating the flowers of the Spirit, our hearts are uplifted, and we become more aware of the precious gift of life, which is to be treasured, and which we share with other people and with all living beings. And I think increasingly I've come to see a particular faith community and religion as, in one sense, a trustee of something which is precious, but is trustee is there for everybody, not the sort of trustee who guards it so that nobody else can approach, but we hold our particular treasures to enrich others. And I think with this also is a concern, particularly for young people, that if we are to grow up in a world at which we understand and live together, then we need to know at least something about other people's religious stories.